At 11:40 a.m., on December 21st Street, 2003, three young men, who were longtime childhood friends, hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-old Sean Blowers and Ashley McGruff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 17 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End remains so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do, and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so, they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck. They hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then, beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so, this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so, the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense, until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finn River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finn River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the Top End. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two, so it almost appeared black. And so, the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere, until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so, at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road, where the vegetation was still very thick. And then, the trio hopped out of the truck. They went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one, they pulled their quad bikes off. And then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so, the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so, for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then, at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so, they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it, and then they were about to get into the truck to head back home, when one of them suggested, "Hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us." Now, you need to understand, in the Top End, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the Top End assume that any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the Top End take. And so, the section of the Finn River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they had also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finn River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so, really, the idea that the Finn River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what? We've been there, done that. Nothing's going to happen to us. And so, they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road, and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the riverbank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries, and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, man, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so, the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically, because the river banks on the edges of the Finn River were very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finn River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water, and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground. And so, they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so, they began to slow down. And then, when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close. And then, one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second. But he turned, and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree, and pulled himself back up. And then, the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him. And the trio just stood there, looking out at this pitch-black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. You know, we'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so, they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then, as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment. And suddenly, the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river. And before long, he's getting pulled downstream. And so, he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers. And so, this was not a high panic situation. This was more like an inconvenience, and maybe a little bit funny. And so, that's why they leapt in, no problem. They figured, you know, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there. And we'll get out, and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so, they actually started to get a little bit worried. And they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for, 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so, they decided, you know what? We have to get out. But we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so, they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so, they yell out to Brett, hey, we're coming to get you. and they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then, the three of them, they stop actively swimming, and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so, at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here. And it will be a great story. And so, Sean is in the front. Ashley is right behind him. And then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then, all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out. Get out. Get out." And so, Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in, and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so, he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water, and as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down, and he sees Ashley. He reaches down, and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then, the pair turn around again to grab Brett. But Brett's not there, and so, they look around. They're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? You know, they're yelling out for him. They're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so, they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, "Hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going?" And they're saying, "No, I don't know where he is." And so, they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then, all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so, he looks straight down, and he sees this yellow thing down there. He nudges Ashley, and he says, "Look." And so, Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is, unless it is at the surface. And so, they're watching this yellow thing. And suddenly, it comes out of the water, and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. He is face down, and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth. And he's not moving. And so, Sean and Ashley are so scared. They're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you too as well. And so, they're staring at this animal, when suddenly, it just kind of goes underneath the water, back down into the black abyss. And it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode, and without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can, and they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so, Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then, once they're situated on their branch, and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, families, they're going to recognize our absence, and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so, as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them, because, yeah, they're safe in this tree. But how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually, they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so, as the two begin comforting each other, assuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so, Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze, and he looks straight down. And at the base of their tree, that black water's the 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world, and they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so, these two teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so, they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so, the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so, the teens are just praying that at some point, it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so, he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy. And then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch, when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water, and so, he hits the water. He goes all the way under. He sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around. And he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so, in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile. But he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so, with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims. And finally, he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of. And he begins pulling himself, with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so, as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs. And finally, he gets to the trunk of the tree, and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on. And then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that has left this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set, about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black, There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area. And so, it is truly pitch black. And so, they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there, because periodically, they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so, they began holding on to each other. And then, anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other. Just so they knew they had not fallen asleep, and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so, a few hours went by like this, where it was silence, with the exception of these sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring. And the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile. And so, they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second. And in that flash, they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so, they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so, they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch, and tried to make themselves as small as they could, while still remaining anchored to each other, and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so, if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic. They were weak. They were tired. And if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so, the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 o'clock a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning, a search had been launched. They had found their truck, and then had been walking down the river, yelling out to them. And then, they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lowered down a ladder that they could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree. And this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it. The boys could still see it. And so, there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so, they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so, as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital, where doctors determined they were physically okay. But both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body, or any of his clothing, or any belongings he had on him. And they never found the crocodile that killed him. In late August of 2004, Kevin Barnsley and his 12-year-old son, Garrett, went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Cube, right inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so, by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, They were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up. They hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so, they got their gear, and they began walking down the very well-defined, 150 meters long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains, and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so, as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. At some point, he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so, he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself. And he told his dad that he didn't care. He'd fish with wet feet and wet pants, and he would change them later. And so, Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, "You know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable. I'm going to go change my pants and my socks." And so, Kevin said, "No problem. I'll be here with our gear. I'll see you when you get back." And so, Garrett stands up, and he starts walking back up the well-defined, 150 meters trail back up towards the campsite. Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees. But he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite, and so knew his son wouldn't be alone for the next couple of minutes. Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder, expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. After about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw their Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat. He's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett. And so, he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up, and Garrett's not in there. There's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so, Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, "Hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago." And the father said, "No, I haven't seen him." And so, Kevin's starting to panic, and he yells out to the group, "Hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here, and no one knew where he was." They said, "No, we haven't seen him." And so, horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. The other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so, hundreds of people have descended into the area on the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him, but later that afternoon, searchers were about a half-mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot, wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so, the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field. And for days, they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere. And so, eventually, the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory was, is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp, and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined, 150 meters long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite, so that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail. He's walking towards the sound of the voices, but he never made it to the campsite, because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father, that caused him to wind up a half-mile away in a boulder field, with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion. But there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby. And you would figure, if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help. But he didn't. He just left his dad. It was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one sock. At 5 a.m. on September 30, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Shin Tia finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Shin reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed. Then he carefully walked around his bed, trying to be as quiet as possible, and then, as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Shin was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so, Shin, he gets next to his wife, and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes, and she looks up at him, and Shin just says, "You know I love you." He gives her a kiss, and he tells her, "Hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight." And so his wife, she, kind of groggy, said, "Okay." And she grabbed his hand and squeezed it. She told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep. Moments later, Shin had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Shin's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour-and-a-half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so, Shin, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. I mean, he was really excited about this day. So Shin was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, and he was a very passionate teacher. But the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Shin loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. I mean, that was his thing. And today, Shin was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaoang, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Shin lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also, there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so, it's just this totally, strikingly beautiful place. And normally, Shin would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaoang, mostly because on the summit there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is, like, spectacular, with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Shin knew an overnight stay was not possible, because he had to be back home by the next day, because it was his mother's 90th birthday. He was very close with his mother, and he was not going to miss that. And so, Shin eventually made it to the train station. He bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. As soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Shin had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Shin, because he loved nature so much, and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. He would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so, Shin passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Shin knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly, because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked. Because Shin did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so, Sheen would ride the train car, and then he would get off, and he would board a bus. And then finally, right around 7 o'clock a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Chenfeng, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaoang. And so, Sheen grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Sheen had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaoang when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Sheen really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Sheen's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would. And so Sheen told him, "Okay, going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow." And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Sheen disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaoang. So, Sheen's wife did not expect to hear from Sheen at any point that day, because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left, that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Sheen, you knew this guy was never late. He said, "I'm going to be someplace at a certain time." He would be there. So when 10 o'clock p.m. rolled around that night, and he still was not back yet, and he had not called, Sheen's wife was actually not worried, because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10 o'clock. He'll be home in the next couple of hours, because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight, and he will be here tonight. And so, she went to bed, expecting to wake up and see Sheen in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning, when she woke up, Sheen was not in bed. So he did not come home. And so, his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Sheen's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so, that day, the family went to the police and they reported Sheen missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Sheen. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaoang is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but you know, it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also, there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place. So if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So, in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that the search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Sheen's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Sheen's cell phone. Because obviously, if they could find that, they might find Sheen too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on. Because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower. And that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Sheen's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Sheen's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in the signal history is the day before. So the day Sheen went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 o'clock p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 o'clock p.m., and the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Sheen's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaoang. It actually was near the base of the mountain, and when police reached out to the person who had called Sheen at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Sheen's. And this friend said that Sheen said he was coming down the mountain now, and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Sheen had told his family. He'd be doing that day, you know, just a quick day hike. Although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd. He'd be down the mountain by 4 o'clock p.m. But still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Sheen. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain, you know. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Sheen was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, you know, to see if maybe Sheen took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Sheen had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Sheen's family told the police about Sheen's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Sheen did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Sheen went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miawang, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Sheen continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th. So, 1 week after Sheen had vanished. On that day, Sheen's cell phone service provider noticed that Sheen's cell phone had suddenly turned back on, and the phone was not on or near Mount Miawang. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so, the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Sheen. But when they got there, Sheen was not there. His phone was not there. You know, they looked at all the security footage. There was no sign of Sheen. They searched the surrounding areas, nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, you know, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chenfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miawang, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Sheen disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miawang. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Sheen. Because now Sheen's face was on the news, and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Sheen. And so this villager said, you know, this guy who looked exactly like Sheen. He walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Sheen, they just chatted for a few minutes. And at some point, this guy who looked like Sheen asked the villager, you know, hey, these are great. But where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so, this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tattoo Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then, after the villager said this guy who looked just like Sheen, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed. His tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, you know, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm going to go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So, away from Mount Miawang. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to, what? Commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tattoo Mountain, to get these walnuts. I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up. He's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miawang. He seems really excited about it, and I offhandedly mention these walnuts, and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then, when police spoke to Sheen's family about this new information, they would learn that Sheen did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Sheen just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tattoo Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miawang. Because he can't stay the night, he needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had, because everything else was a dead end. And so, they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miawang to Tattoo Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Sheen could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain, and when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Sheen would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Sheen would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly. Because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there were some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so, just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so, it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Sheen's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said, "Indeed hiked up Tattoo Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then, on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here." And so, that explained the campsite. And then, on October 1 Street, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridgeline down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by." Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news, because suddenly, it seemed totally possible that Sheen was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe. Albeit, I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there. Follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Sheen got a phone call at 4:00 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Sheen told him that he was coming down Mount Miaoan and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible, because the note said Sheen, at 4:00 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tattoo Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost. And ultimately, in that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so, in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Sheen's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Sheen to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view. Sheen has gotten lost. He's by himself. He's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him. And so it really should have been written in the first person. "My name is Sheen. I am lost. Here's what I'm doing." But the note was written in the third person. Sheen got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow, he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Sheen was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward. And then the very final line, which says, "Loved everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So, everyone who passes by is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us, like, that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward it would be like if I tried to say to you, take the bus to work, but instead I said, to work take bus. Right? Like, I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so, this last line stood out so much that actually police, and friends, and family of Sheen assumed he must have left that in there as, like, a secret message or a code, like a distress signal. Especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Sheen's campsite on Tattoo Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned a corner, and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff. And dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Sheen's whereabouts, yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something. And then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up, and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Sheen's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery, because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones. And the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees. And they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well and inside of this cave. And so, in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Sheen's campsite. But none of the human remains belonged to Sheen. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Sheen's case. It meant all these people had previously gone up Tattoo Mountain before Sheen went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them. And we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taking people out? I mean, we don't know. But what started to happen since Sheen went missing, and his story was all over the news in China, is that all these other hikers who'd been on Tattoo Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tattoo Mountain. And some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain. They had their partner with them, who was a little bit farther back down the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own. And the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe. And he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, partner's back there. They're coming up here, what's going on?" But the axeman basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, partner's back there." And the axeman again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. Then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tattoo Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up and they saw a ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, all these people, like this group of strangers, just stand. They were kind of half behind trees, like they were sort of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker and moving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left. And they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously, we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tattoo Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Sheen's story, it really makes you wonder what's going on up there. The official search for Sheen was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Sheen continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been